Welcome to Sleep with History. Today, we are going to talk the chronicle. Above the clouds, beyond the headlines, spy balloons, and the long shadow of aerial surveillance. Early in 2023, Americans began glancing skyward at an unfamiliar object, a bright white balloon drifting across the continental United States. For days, the story dominated headlines, trending across social media. People speculated wildly. Was it a weather experiment? A surveillance platform? A harbinger of a new Cold War? Spy balloons, however, are not new. In fact, they are older than most forms of aerial surveillance. The recent surge in sightings is less a sudden technological breakthrough and more a reminder of how human beings have always sought the high ground to see farther than their adversaries. Understanding this history sheds light on three core realities: why spy balloons are appearing in headlines now, whether they are genuinely new or simply newly visible, and why these sleepers of surveillance history reveal something about the future of intelligence gathering. First recorded military use of balloons dates to the French Revolutionary Wars in the 1790s. The French army established the aérostats, an early air corps that used tethered balloons to observe Austrian troop movements. The logic was simple. The higher you go, the more you can see. By the American Civil War, both Union and Confederate forces experimented with observation balloons. They floated above battlefields, sketching troop positions and relaying signals to artillery units below. The public often mocked these contraptions as gas bags, but their impact on battlefield awareness was undeniable. This early history shows that balloons were not fringe technology. They were mainstream military tools, and crucially, a way to bypass the limitations of ground-based observation. Spy balloons reached their first true golden age in the early Cold War. Before the U-2 and satellite reconnaissance, the U.S. and its allies desperately needed a way to peer behind the Iron Curtain. Balloons were cheap, high-flying, and expendable. Project Moby Dick in the 1950s launched thousands of high-altitude balloons from Europe and the Pacific, equipped with cameras that drifted across the Soviet Union, snapping photos of airfields, missile silos, and rail networks. Project Genetrix in 1956 sent over 500 balloons across communist territories. Though many were shot down or recovered, the images they returned were often the first hard evidence of Soviet capabilities. For obvious reasons, these operations were classified. But declassified documents show just how dependent early Cold War intelligence was on balloons. Satellites were still unreliable and expensive. Spy planes risked pilot capture. Balloons filled the gap. By the late 1960s and 1970s, however, satellites and high-altitude aircraft had largely displaced balloons. Space-based reconnaissance offered predictable orbits and much greater resolution. Aircraft like the SR-71 could outrun most air defenses. Balloons, slow and at the mercy of wind, seemed obsolete. Yet they never truly vanished. Meteorological agencies and defense laboratories continued to use them for signals intelligence, radar testing, and payload experiments. The key advantages: high altitude, low cost, and passive operation remained. Today, those same advantages are sparking a renaissance. Balloons can loiter over an area much longer than drones or satellites. They're relatively cheap compared to launching a satellite or running a manned aircraft. And they're stealthy by obscurity. Until recently, the public rarely noticed them. The recent uptick in sightings is mostly about detection, not deployment. Modern radar systems, particularly NEXRAD, weather radars, and updated military tracking networks, have become much better at spotting slow-moving, high-altitude objects. In the past, air defense filters were tuned to ignore such returns, treating them as weather clutter or inconsequential debris. When the U.S. military adjusted its radar parameters in 2022 and 2023, it suddenly saw dozens of previously overlooked objects. Some were hobbyist balloons, some were corporate research platforms, some were almost certainly intelligence-gathering craft. This is a classic example of the streetlight effect in surveillance. You find what you're looking for, or more accurately, what your instruments are calibrated to see. On paper, satellites outperform balloons in many ways. They're harder to intercept, cover larger areas, and carry heavier sensors. But balloons excel in niche areas. A satellite passes over a target area only for a few minutes per orbit, whereas a balloon can linger for hours or days. High-altitude balloons can collect radio, cell, or radar emissions from a fixed spot, which satellites can't always do. A balloon program costs millions, whereas a new spy satellite costs billions. And balloons can be launched quietly and quickly for crises. For nations or organizations lacking space capability, balloons are also the low barrier entry point into strategic surveillance. Another underreported aspect is how spy balloons give weaker states or non-state actors a way to counter technologically superior rivals. A developing country might not have a satellite program, but it can launch a balloon with off-the-shelf electronics. Balloons can be made semi-disposable. If shot down, they represent a minor financial loss and provide little intelligence to the opponent. This creates a classic asymmetric dynamic. The same reason guerrilla tactics work on the ground. Balloons are not a replacement for satellites or drones. They're a way to complicate an adversary's surveillance and air defense picture. Why did spy balloons trigger such a public frenzy in 2023 when the technology is centuries old? 3 reasons stand out. First, symbolism. A visible foreign object drifting over a nation's skis taps into primal fears of vulnerability. Second, transparency. Smartphones and social media now mean any strange object is instantly photographed and broadcast globally. Third, geopolitics. The timing coincided with rising U.S.-China tensions, making the balloon a lightning rod for political narratives. In the past, governments quietly handled such incursions. Today, secrecy is harder, and the media's incentive is to dramatize. Surveillance balloons also raise thorny questions about sovereignty. Unlike satellites, which orbit in outer space beyond national airspace, balloons remain within the airspace of the state they overfly. This technically constitutes an incursion, similar to a spy plane. The 1960 U-2 incident, in which Gary Powers was shot down over the USSR, remains the closest analog. Nations may legally intercept or destroy intruding balloons, but the attribution problem complicates matters. Balloons can drift off course, or their origin may be obscured. The Chicago Convention on International Civil Aviation, 1944, gives states full sovereignty over their airspace. Yet, there's no comprehensive treaty for unmanned aerial vehicles at stratospheric altitudes. This legal gray zone ensures balloons will remain diplomatically tricky. Modern surveillance balloons are far more sophisticated than Cold War versions. Solar power arrays enable multi-week flights. Miniaturized sensors allow high-resolution cameras, hyperspectral imagers, and electronic listening devices to be carried easily. Autonomous navigation with adjustable ballast and AI-driven steering systems gives more control over flight paths. Encrypted data links allow near real-time transmission of intelligence. In other words, today's balloon is closer to a slow-moving satellite than to a child's party decoration. Companies like Worldview Enterprises and Raven Aerostar are pioneering stratolites, long-duration, stratospheric platforms capable of station keeping over a region. These systems blur the line between drone and balloon, offering persistent coverage at a fraction of satellite cost. We can expect hybrid platforms combining lighter-than-air vehicles with solar-powered propellers. Massive constellations similar to satellite networks, but in the stratosphere, and expanded civilian uses like broadband internet, disaster monitoring, and climate research, potentially normalizing high-altitude balloons in everyday life. As these proliferate, distinguishing civilian from military balloons will become even harder, echoing today's debates about dual-use technologies. Calling balloons sleepers is apt because they've always lurked just off the public radar. Periods of technological eclipse have been followed by bursts of renewed interest. 1790s, France to the 1860s, U.S. Civil War, to the 1950s, Cold War, to the 2020s, modern resurgence. This cyclical pattern suggests balloons will remain a quiet but persistent part of the surveillance ecosystem. They are not cutting-edge disruptors, but enduring complements to flashier technologies. Ultimately, spy balloons are about perception, both what they see and how we see them. Intelligence officers, policymakers, and the public must balance caution with perspective. Overreaction can escalate tensions. Underreaction can leave vulnerabilities exposed. Recognizing balloons as part of a long tradition of aerial reconnaissance helps demystify them. They're tools not omens, though, like all tools, their impact depends on context and intent. Think of satellites as commuter trains, fast, predictable, covering large areas, and balloons as parked surveillance vans, slower, less glamorous, but able to sit and listen for hours. Both have their place in the surveillance fleet. As detection systems improve, more slow, high-altitude objects will be reported, from weather balloons to scientific platforms. The public should expect more headlines, not fewer, as transparency increases. Learning to differentiate between legitimate threats and benign craft will be the real challenge of the 2020s. Spy balloons may seem novel, but they are part of a centuries-old quest for the aerial high ground. Their reappearance in the news owes more to improved detection and heightened geopolitical tension than to a sudden technological leap. Understanding the historical continuity of balloon surveillance helps diffuse panic and encourages a more nuanced debate about national security, privacy, and international norms. They're not new, just newly visible. They fill a unique niche alongside satellites and drones. Their future is entwined with both civilian innovation and military competition. By seeing beyond the headlines, we gain a clearer picture not just of the balloons overhead, but of the forces shaping our 21st century sky, the dawn of aerial espionage. In the age before satellites, before spy planes streaked across borders at the edge of space, the quest to see beyond the horizon began with something far simpler: balloons. Long before the term aerial intelligence entered military jargon, commanders understood that a bird's-eye view conferred a decisive edge. From the smoky battlefields of the American Civil War to the frozen trenches of the Western Front and the experimental hangars of the interwar years, lighter-than-air craft quietly shaped the evolution of modern reconnaissance. Forgotten origins, Civil War observation balloons. During the American Civil War, the Union Army's Balloon Corps pioneered the use of tethered observation balloons to spy on Confederate troop movements. Operating under Thaddeus S.C. Lowe, these balloons rose hundreds of feet above the battlefield, providing panoramic views of enemy positions. Lowe even established a telegraph line from the basket to the ground, so observers could transmit real-time information. A primitive but revolutionary version of today's live intelligence feeds. The Confederacy tried its own balloon operations, but shortages of materials and infrastructure limited their success. The Union's balloons, though vulnerable to artillery fire and weather, gave commanders a vital edge at battles like Fair Oaks and Fredericksburg. The concept was simple: altitude equals information. Yet the implications were profound. For the first time, armies had a sustained aerial perspective on war. Critically, these early balloons also introduced the challenges that would define aerial espionage for decades. Balloons were at the mercy of winds. They were visible, slow, and hard to maneuver. And yet, their strategic value outweighed their drawbacks. cementing the principle that even imperfect aerial surveillance could shift battlefield dynamics. WWI's silent watchers, gas, cameras, and artillery. Half a century later, the First World War transformed observation balloons from quirky novelties into systematic intelligence platforms. This time, technology had caught up with ambition. Hydrogen and improved fabric construction allowed balloons to reach higher altitudes and remain aloft longer. Most importantly, advances in photography and optics gave observers the ability to capture and interpret enemy movements with unprecedented detail. Each army on the Western Front deployed large numbers of kite balloons, elongated, sausage-shaped envelopes tethered to the ground and stabilized with fins. These balloons carried trained artillery spotters who relayed coordinates by telephone down to the gun batteries below. In an age when indirect fire dominated, such real-time spotting could determine the outcome of entire battles. The balloons also carried cameras capable of taking vertical and oblique images, feeding the burgeoning science of photo reconnaissance. Air superiority was still contested by biplanes, but balloons offered a persistent watch over enemy trenches, supply depots, and troop movements. They became such valuable targets that each side maintained specialized balloon buster fighter units tasked with destroying them. Despite their vulnerability, WWI balloons pioneered many principles that endure today. Integration of aerial intelligence with ground forces, rapid relay of coordinates, and the fusion of human observation with photographic data. They were the silent watchers, floating above the roar of artillery, making war more precise and more deadly. Interwar experimental leaps, the first high-altitude platforms. After the armistice, most nations cut back on large-scale balloon operations, but a core of innovators saw the potential for high-altitude, long-duration surveillance. The interwar period witnessed a surge of experimentation as scientists and militaries pushed the limits of lighter-than-air flight. One stream focused on stratospheric balloons, capable of ascending far above the weather and the reach of most aircraft. In the 1930s, Swiss physicist August Piccard's record-setting ascents in pressurized gondolas demonstrated that humans and instruments could survive at altitudes previously thought impossible. His flights carried scientific payloads, but they also hinted at military applications. A platform in the stratosphere could see hundreds of miles in every direction, gather signals, and potentially launch or guide weapons. Simultaneously, military planners studied aerostats and barrage balloons not just as defensive tools, but as potential communication relays and intelligence posts. Airship programs, notably Germany's Zeppelin fleet, explored long-endurance patrol and reconnaissance missions over oceans, foreshadowing later strategic uses of high-altitude craft. Though the Treaty of Versailles restricted Germany's military aviation, its civilian Zeppelin program continued technological development with obvious dual-use implications. This interwar experimentation established the technological DNA for the Cold War's spy balloons. The drive for altitude, persistence, and multi-sensor payloads can all be traced back to the 1920s and 1930s, when engineers first imagined floating platforms as something more than novelty rides. Legacy and significance. Taken together, these three eras show a continuous thread. Whenever technology offered a chance to see farther and stay aloft longer, militaries seized it. Civil War balloons proved the concept. World War, I-kite balloons integrated aerial eyes with modern artillery and photographic intelligence. The interwar years sketched the blueprint for high-altitude surveillance and the eventual leap to satellites. This history also underscores a paradox. Balloons were simultaneously primitive and futuristic. They relied on fabric, gas, and wind. Yet they embodied the timeless military imperative to control information. Even today's cutting-edge drones and satellites echo the same goals: persistent presence, real-time intelligence, and a higher vantage point than the adversary. As we look up at the stratospheric platforms of the 21st century, it's worth remembering that the dawn of aerial espionage began not with stealth jets or orbiting satellites, but with quiet, gas-filled envelopes drifting above the smoke of battle. Cold War's silent sentinels. The Cold War was a conflict fought not just on battlefields or in political halls, but in the skies above, where nations raced to see farther, faster, and with greater precision than their rivals. In this high-stakes arena, balloons, seemingly simple, slow, and unremarkable, emerged as silent sentinels, quietly shaping intelligence, gathering, and shaping the course of global events. Long before satellites could circle the globe and drones could hover over contested regions, the United States and the Soviet Union relied on high-altitude balloons for reconnaissance. Among the most ambitious of these initiatives was Project Genetrix, launched in 1956. Thousands of balloons, filled with hydrogen and carrying photographic equipment, were released over communist territories in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Their mission was to capture images of airfields, military installations, and industrial sites, providing intelligence that conventional spies could rarely obtain. The operation was daring, but fraught with risk. Many balloons were shot down, lost to weather, or drifted into unintended airspace. Yet each photograph returned represented a glimpse into a world that was otherwise opaque, offering planners the first modern aerial maps of the Eastern Bloc's strategic capabilities. Parallel to the balloon programs, the U-2 spy plane soared above 70,000 feet, providing high-resolution intelligence with speed and maneuverability that balloons could not match. Yet, balloons retained a unique advantage. They could linger over a target area for hours or days, collecting a continuous stream of data, while the U-2's high-speed overflights were fleeting and easily noticed. Together, the balloons and U-2 flights represented a complementary system, an early version of the integrated intelligence networks that dominate modern reconnaissance. Ingenuity of the era extended beyond simply sending balloons aloft. Programs such as Skyhook pushed the boundaries of what was possible with aerial reconnaissance. Skyhook balloons were massive, high-altitude platforms designed to carry instruments over enemy territory for extended periods. Their missions often required daring recovery operations. When the balloon descended or the payload returned to Earth, specially trained crews would capture it midair using aircraft equipped with grappling hooks. These missions demanded precise coordination and nerves of steel. Yet they were instrumental in retrieving critical intelligence without alerting adversaries. The recovered payloads contained cameras, sensors, and even experimental equipment to intercept communications. All valuable tools in a world where information was as potent as conventional weaponry. Perhaps the most consequential moment for balloon-based surveillance came during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. As American leaders grappled with the discovery of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, every piece of intelligence mattered. While U-2 flights delivered dramatic overhead imagery, balloons provided persistent monitoring, tracking movements, and relaying signals from critical sites. Their silent presence above hostile territory offered a constant, low-profile source of information that complemented satellite reconnaissance, ensuring that decision-makers had a fuller picture of the unfolding crisis. In these tense weeks, balloons were more than instruments. They were guardians, quietly hovering in the stratosphere while the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war. Beyond individual operations, the Cold War cemented the strategic value of balloons in the intelligence community's collective mindset. They demonstrated that even seemingly simple technology, if used creatively, could produce outsized effects. The ability to position a sensor high above enemy territory, observe, and retrieve information without immediate risk to human pilots was revolutionary. It also set a precedent. Modern aerial surveillance would always blend multiple platforms, aircraft, satellites, and balloons to maximize coverage, persistence, and secrecy. As decades passed and satellites became dominant, balloons receded from the headlines, but never truly vanished. The lessons learned from Genetrix, Skyhook, and Cold War operations informed later programs. From high-altitude weather platforms to modern stratospheric reconnaissance systems, their legacy is subtle but enduring. Balloons proved that intelligence could be gathered quietly, persistently, and at a fraction of the cost of other high-tech solutions, a principle that continues to influence surveillance strategy today. In retrospect, the Cold War's silent sentinels were more than historical curiosities. They were foundational tools that shaped the modern intelligence apparatus. By combining patience, ingenuity, and daring, these high-altitude observers transformed the art of espionage, reminding the world that in the struggle for information, the sky was never the limit, only the beginning. Technological leaps and covert adaptations, the history of aerial surveillance is as much a story of human ingenuity as it is of mechanical evolution. Balloons and lighter-than-air platforms have always been simple in concept. A floating platform high above the earth. But their effectiveness has depended entirely on the sophistication of their payloads, the gases that keep them aloft, and the clever ways operators have hidden their presence. From analog cameras to digital sensors, from hydrogen to helium, and from visible targets to stealthy, deceptive craft, the evolution of balloons mirrors the broader arc of intelligence technology. In the early decades of aerial reconnaissance, balloons carried analog cameras, often bulky and fragile. Photographs had to be taken manually, sometimes using timed shutters or even primitive remote triggers. Observers relied on visual spotting as much as photography, and every image had to be retrieved physically, often through perilous recovery operations. Despite these limitations, early camera-equipped balloons offered a revolutionary perspective. They could map enemy positions, supply lines, and fortifications from angles ground-based scouts could never achieve. The clarity was limited, the coverage sporadic, but the principle was sound. The higher the vantage, the richer the intelligence. By the mid-20th century, technological innovation began transforming payload capabilities. Cameras became smaller, more precise, and increasingly automated. During Cold War projects like Genetrix and Skyhook, balloons carried multiple camera systems that could snap high-resolution images at set intervals, sometimes in multiple spectral ranges. These developments enabled the capture of strategic intelligence over vast areas without putting pilots at risk. Later, as digital sensors emerged, balloons gained the ability to record not just static images, but signals intelligence, electronic emissions, and even environmental data. The progression from simple photographs to multi-sensor digital payloads turned balloons into versatile platforms capable of gathering intelligence across domains, from visual imagery to electronic surveillance. Parallel to payload innovation, the physical design of balloons underwent critical changes. Early balloons relied on hydrogen for lift, a choice driven by availability and cost. Hydrogen provided superior buoyancy, but was highly flammable, making long-duration missions risky. In response, military and scientific operators gradually transitioned to helium, a stable and inert gas. Although helium offered slightly less lift, it dramatically improved mission safety and longevity. The transition solved one of the most persistent technical challenges: keeping a balloon aloft reliably for weeks or months without catastrophic failure. With enhanced payloads and safer lift gases, operators faced a new problem: visibility. A balloon drifting conspicuously in the sky is inherently vulnerable, and nations invested heavily in stealth and deception. Camouflage and reflective coatings could render balloons harder to detect visually or by radar. Some payloads were designed to mimic clouds or blend into atmospheric layers. Others exploited high-altitude winds to remain in regions where detection was minimal. Covert adaptations included using minimal or directional radio transmissions, carefully timing photography to avoid observation, and employing flight paths that masked the origin of the platform. In essence, balloons became both sensors and silent actors in a game of disguise, quietly collecting intelligence while appearing innocuous or unremarkable to casual observers. These technological leaps were not limited to military applications. Scientific and civilian innovations often dovetailed with covert intelligence objectives. High-altitude research balloons, designed for meteorology or cosmic observations, pioneered materials, sensors, and flight controls later adapted for surveillance. Similarly, advances in miniaturization, digital imaging, and communications, driven by broader electronics and aerospace industries, allowed balloons to become lighter, smarter, and more autonomous. Today's stratospheric platforms can hover for weeks, gather multi-domain data, and relay it in near real-time, capabilities unimaginable just a few decades ago. The combination of evolving payloads, safer gases, and stealth measures has ensured that balloons remain relevant even in the era of satellites and drones. They demonstrate a unique advantage: persistent presence. While satellites orbit on fixed paths and drones must be piloted or remotely controlled, balloons can loiter over a specific region for days or weeks, offering uninterrupted observation. Their adaptability, both technical and operational, has allowed them to survive the technological upheavals of the past century, quietly evolving to meet new challenges. In the end, the story of balloons is a story of adaptation. From the earliest analog cameras to today's digital multi-sensor platforms, from hydrogen-filled bursts of flight to stable helium long-duration missions, and from visible, vulnerable craft to stealthy, deceptive assets, each innovation reflects a human drive to see farther and know more. Balloons may drift slowly, invisible against the expanse of sky, but they carry within them a history of technological leaps and covert ingenuity that continues to shape how nations gather intelligence. The future is already here. The horizon of aerial surveillance is no longer confined to traditional airspace or low Earth orbit. Today, near-space platforms are pushing the limits of what humanity can observe and communicate from above. These high-altitude balloons, long-duration aerostats, and stratospheric drones operate in a zone roughly 20 to 100 kilometers above the Earth, a region too high for conventional aircraft and too low for satellites. In this near space, frontier, persistent observation and communication networks are becoming a reality, and the implications for intelligence, commerce, and society are profound. Modern near-space platforms can remain aloft for weeks or even months, maintaining a quasi-stationary position above a target area. Unlike satellites, which follow predictable orbits, these platforms offer persistent coverage, allowing continuous monitoring of environmental conditions, communications traffic, or terrestrial activity. Communications companies are experimenting with them as high-altitude internet relays, providing broadband to remote regions. Militaries, meanwhile, see them as a low-cost alternative to satellites for surveillance, reconnaissance, and signals intelligence. The persistence and flexibility of near-space platforms blur the line between commercial and military use, raising questions about dual-use technology and the potential for conflicts over airspace sovereignty. Alongside hardware advancements, AI and autonomous navigation are transforming the role of aerial surveillance. Modern platforms can adjust their position using machine learning algorithms, optimize flight paths based on weather and atmospheric conditions, and autonomously manage sensors to collect maximum intelligence with minimal human input. This autonomy reduces the need for continuous human monitoring, enabling faster response times and more efficient operations. AI-driven analytics also allow the platforms themselves to pre-process raw data, highlighting anomalies or strategic targets before it even reaches human analysts. In effect, the balloon or stratospheric drone becomes an intelligent observer, capable of making preliminary judgments in the field, a fundamental shift from passive data collection to semi-autonomous decision-making.